kindest introduction ever. I'm very sorry I can't be there. Distances really feel like distances these days. So I'm in Helsinki. It's 8 p.m. on a Friday night. So I think for the rest of the event, I may have to join by watching the videos. So I'll share my little thing. So I'll talk around the kind of, it's a bit of an ephemeral title, but I'll be talking about different rhythms and distractions around the book that came out last year, but it was in the making for 10 years. So it was definitely not one of those kind of light and breezy projects that just happen, because sometimes that happens. That was not one of them, and it almost didn't happen. And the starting points of the project, I don't think are particularly relevant here, because where I ended up was something quite different over a decade. Stuff tends to happen in a person's lives. But one kind of key starting point for the book was this there's a kind of a feedback sound. Was this kind of plethora of analyses, both popular and scholarly, and things in between. I mean, journalistic, scholarly, and kind of meme, partly art, commenting on the negative impact, nefarious impact of network media and social media in particular, app culture, mobile phones, on our capacity to focus, to be, to communicate, to think, to remember. I mean, from the Shallows, that basically argues that we are becoming shallow and dumb, to Shay Turkle's critique of the death of conversation, and she's published plenty on that, or Het Loving's take on app design as something that is making us sad, alienated, and empty by design. So I was really interested, I mean, having kind of a training in cultural history. Technically, I'm a trained cultural historian. I was really interested in the kind of how familiar these narratives did sound, even as the technological and social frameworks in which they were articulated are very distinct. So I started thinking of mid-19th century analyses or kind of critiques of the telegraph, the critique that everything is so fast, there's so much trivia, like the birth of the modern news, that what's newsworthy is suddenly just this stuff, and we are bombarded with this. And this happened in conjunction with, of course, I mean, industrialization and modernity. So, I mean, stuff like Simmel's take on distractions in the modern metropolis. There's so much out there. Bright lights, big cities, too much is on offer. We can't focus on anything because there's a kind of abundance of stuff. So we just become bored. So I really became interested in what's specific and what repeats these kinds of narrative tropes that seem to have great allure. I mean, they seem to speak of something that's going on, but at the same time, they seem to repeat in different variations over time. And since I'm also very nerdy, I got into all kinds of rabbit holes for quite a long time. So I'm going to plug my book for a while because I love the cover. So hence the picture. So what the book basically is about, it's looking at three, what I identify as affective formations. So notion of dependence, that of distraction and boredom. And of course, these have to do with the kind of diagnosis of our times that we are dependent or addicted to media technology that distracts us to boredom. And then what I tried to do was to think of these affective formations as more ambiguous dynamics. So thinking of dependence in connection to kind of, in terms of like infrastructural dependencies and connected to agency, thinking of distraction, obviously, in a dynamic tension and connection with attention, and that's what I'll be talking about today. But I'll also briefly talk about how boredom and interest play into one another. So that was basically what I set out to do. Key material for the book were student essays that I collected over 8 years, I think, maybe maybe more, maybe 9. And I have something like 175 of those, like little stories that describe how it feels when media technology fails. How does it feel? And I use those as points of entrance, and I'll use some quotes as I go along to make things a bit more concrete. These kind of small stories of living in a very media saturated, kind of app heavy culture. Although, I mean, the first ones are from 2012, so already kinds of historical. That's the thing with research. It's sometimes slow, and what we end up doing is present history. But I really got fascinated with the notion of ambiguity, and then I realized that's actually something I've been working on for a long time. That's sort of been a topic that has been popping up, but I haven't really zoomed in on it. So I really started to think about ambiguity, not in terms of ambivalence, as in having mixed feelings about something. So it's not so much about a person's attitude or evaluation of a situation. Ambiguity is more fundamentally about things, be those cultural objects, be those phenomena, not being reducible to one single interpretation or outcome. That by default, they are both and, they can be both and, in different constellations, obviously. And then what then happens to critical inquiry in this environment where we have very kind of firm theories and firm views about what media technology is doing to us, what does it then mean to work with this logic of both and, like, without becoming kind of relativistic? You know, it kind of depends. That's not my point. So I'll talk a little about the kind of ambiguity and why I think that's critical. The main reason why I thought it was the thing to do was precisely that we seem to be kind of recurrently encountering this narrative of loss. I miss my pre-internet brain, the loss of conversation, things have been lost. And then, you know, if we think of transformation in terms of loss, then of course that's what we're going to see. But then what happens if we also think about, you know, what emerges? When things change, we lose something and something else comes up. And is it reducible to a narrative of loss? And I think it's not. And all of this, of course, happens in the framework of data capitalism. And I have much to say about data capitalism, but I will not today because I don't have the time. So one kind of reference here would be Xiang Nai's work on affective categories or aesthetic categories, where she's, for example, talking about how boredom is always tied in with interest, for example. But it's a very different project. It really is about aesthetics. But it's not like I'm the only one trying to grapple this logic of both and here. In affect inquiry, there tends to be this kind of broad narrative or broad dynamic of divisions made between the positive and the negative. The affects that enliven us, that increase our capacities to live, and then that which does the opposite, reduces our capacity to live and be. But if we take an approach that it's more about ambiguity, then it becomes about both and, then we end on a very kind of shiftier ground of oscillating intensities, different kinds of complexities that might attract us, capture our attention momentarily. And all of this, it's not just reducible to the kind of logic of likes, ha-has, good vibes in the realm of positive affect. Sorry. For example, I mean, thinking of doom scrolling as a practice, like I'm 2 hours away from the Russian border. So I've been very preoccupied with doom scrolling for the past week or so. And of course, and we can talk about what it is, but I mean, one thing it's an effective sinkhole. But if we think about it, it's pretty hard to tell where attention starts and distraction ends. And what is compelling about that. We can also enjoy things. There can be pleasure to things that are painful, that are hurtful. I mean, thinking of pleasure as an ambiguous thing, that's not just about the ha-has, the funs and the good times. Pleasure in all its shapes and forms can be very dark. It can be very violent, and it's complex. And that's kind of a different conversation. But I'm interested in this kind of both and kind of simultaneity. And I think that's really crucial in and for critical inquiry, unless we want to get caught up in this kind of appeal of dystopian romanticism. And I don't think that is helpful if we also want to aid transformative politics somehow with the kind of inquiry that we do. At least, and even if not that, at least to acknowledge the complexity of the phenomena we study. We all know who study, I think people who study culture and society know that stuff is complex. So I think there is like an ethic responsibility to accounting for that complexity in the work that we do. So, for example, distraction, attention, topics of today. What then happens if we don't think about them in terms of like opposing or kind of like mutually opposing or polar opposites of one another in terms of anything, if we think about them in terms of dynamics of interest. I mean, one of the examples that I started out with at some point was the Microsoft Research Canada's kind of a report for advertisers on capturing online attention. And it had like a very clickbait compatible headline, your attention span, or the attention span of an average Canadian is now shorter than that of a goldfish. And of course, then that spread as news that supported this sense of, you know, acute crisis in our capacity to focus and be this kind of like culture of the shallow. And of course, the kind of argument about the goldfish, how you measure goldfish's attention span was one thing, but the thing that people in psychology understandably enough picked up is that there is no such thing as an average attention span to be measured because it's always context specific. So for example, if you're driving a car for the first time, you need to focus pretty much. If you do it, you know, after 10 years of doing that daily, then you probably don't need to focus that much. It's also about interest. If you're interested in something, then, you know, you might want to pay attention. So it's also connected to care, how much you care about things, how much of interest things are. So there is no kind of like medium average capacity. It's always context sensitive, which I think is pretty obvious if you think about that. And it then follows that the speeds, rhythms, and dynamics of, for example, browsing an app. There is seduction to saying, you know, TikTok culture, like 30-second videos, or, you know, the kind of speed of a snap is now our speed of attention. But then what then happens if we start generalizing the experience of using an app, particular app, or a range of apps to describe the kind of current culture or sociability or just the capacity to be and think? I mean, in comparison, one and the same person who might enjoy a quick snap can also really be into binge watching, spending 2 days binging over several series or seasons of a TV series. ASMR, Inge already mentioned. I mean, that is the speed and dynamic of that. It is many things, but it's not snap, snap, snap. And that actually applies to a lot of tube content. The extended focus you need in online gaming, like people can, you know, sit in their chair for 7 hours, extended focus. What focus does it take to produce social media content that people then consume in a very fast way? So if the thing being like there are different speeds and dynamics and rhythms to different apps, but there are also different rhythms and speeds to using using these apps, using different kinds of things within that same thing, and then producing content. So there are multiple platforms, multiple rhythms that change and intermesh, and we sort of navigate between them constantly. So that then means that one and the same person can be engaged in very different intensities of attention, obviously. And this is, of course, not to say that the capturing of attention, the, you know, grabbing people by the eyeballs, that it's not a thing. that addictive design, app design, device design is not a thing. Of course they are. I mean, data capitalism is a framework for all of this. And the logic of social media, it's very much about this, as probably anyone participating in this seminar would know, or at least would be familiar with the discussions if they don't agree with the diagnosis. My issue is not with this argument. My issue is with the decontextualized and generalized takes on forms of attention and interest. I think there's a lot of sloppiness in many of the kind of diagnoses that we encounter daily. So I think we need to take care, we need to be specific in how we think about mundane mediated engagements with different devices, platforms across different contexts. And I would say this especially, I would say the importance of doing this has grown manifest with the lockdowns, the 2 previous years, that have made quite evident the extent to which networked connectivity is a matter of infrastructure for societies to work, for sociability to work, for people to connect on different levels. So one of the arguments in my book is now obvious, because the argument that network media are infrastructural, it's become obvious, but it really was less so at some point. I think when I was writing, at least it wasn't discussed as kind of a common knowledge at some point when I was working on the book. So in a sense, I think that it came out, at a right moment, although it took ages to do. So we then might like to think, or I would like to think, attention and distraction in terms of kind of qualities of interest, qualities of care. So rhythm, tempo, intensity, temporality, different scales of attention. So basically distraction can be understood as your attention being attached to something else than it was previously attached to. But the intensities are not the same. So kind of deep focus attention obviously is different than like a random titillating interest in something that you browse through. Hence the question of scale, rhythm, tempo, intensity. But this also means that it's possible to consider attention and distraction as sort of like patterns in the same fabric, rather than as these kind of like opposing things. And here I have found affect inquiry actually very useful, which isn't surprising because I've been at it for a long time at this point. Attention distraction, of course, are not affects as such. Boredom is not a matter of affect, it's a matter of affective flatness, for that matter. But I would like to propose that interest and excitement are definitely about affect. And if we think of attention and the rerouting of attention in moments of distraction as a matter of interest, then we shift very much into that terrain. This is a quote from Sylvan Tompkins. It's from the Affect Imagery Consciousness, kind of the compendium book. And basically he's talking about something quite different, or something specific. Basically, it's more about identity. So like, for example, a musician is excited by music, hence they are musicians, or let's say a scholar is a nerd excited by these rabbit holes and hence is a scholar. I particularly got focused on this when I was working on a book on sex and play, and it sort of remained with me. So for Tompkins, excitement is the more intense, stronger form of interest. And he writes kind of poetically about excitement as that which invests everything with a sense of magic. Like without excitement, things don't really matter. So it's also like an affective amplifier that really makes us care, makes us pay attention. And I've been interested in shifting this kind of idea of excitement being that which makes the self in a more heterogeneous formulation. So that these kinds of excitements can be very minor, they can be fleeting, random, discontinuous, they can be mutually contradicting. We can be excited by things that don't really gel into like a narrative of the self in any easy way. at any given moment, we are likely to have multiple objects of excitement that constantly make us and then unmake us because stuff changes, basically. And I think this also helps to see how excitements of different kinds, they dot and pattern everyday lives. That this kind of, both these persistent engulfing passions that have both intensity and endurance, in as much as these minor sparks of interest that basically don't a bonfire make, but they nevertheless may leave their marks in how we are. So this is a matter of scales, and I'm sorry, I have been doing talks on distraction for a number of years, and I seem unable to do them without animated GIFs. But these are kind of Zoom friendly, so they're not too blinky and they're kind of slow. For a long time, I did talks where I had, one GIF every 20 seconds because I was trying to distract the audience, kind of manipulate them. That was very bad of me, but on Zoom, I don't think it's really the nice thing to do. I mean, it was never a nice thing to do. But then again, I'm not a very nice person. So if we're thinking of this, I mean, thinking of scales doesn't mean pitting the kind of macro against the micro, but within this logic of both, and it's actually attending to both. Because we have this macro level analysis of what's happening to culture, society, our cognitive capacities, even our somatic capacities, kind of like the undifferentiated subject, us or we, us all. And then we have the stuff of everyday life that is more on the level of micro, that is a mess, basically. I'm thinking of John Law's invitation to embrace mess in social sciences inquiry. That's one of the inspirations for the project. So I started thinking of different ways to work with the notion of micro. So Brian Masumi's work on micro shocks, this kind of like surprising, unintended encounters in everyday life that we might or might not register. So the scale is very kind of, it's not that intense, it's not that sharp, where something nevertheless changes as something grabs us from one moment to another. And these shocks can also be shocks, more like startled surprise, where something then shifts in a way that we notice. Or even Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's discussion on microflow experiences, which then are actually, they are sought out, they're very much intentional. These little lifts in everyday life, bit of banter in the coffee room, doodling when you're in a boring meeting and so forth. These little escapes, or Taylor and Cohen's escape attempts, kind of daydreaming, drug use, sex as means of escaping the kind of dull repetitions and routines of everyday life. And I've been interested in working between scales of how to talk about data culture, data societies, data-fied societies, and the economies and politics that go with that, and still hold on to the kind of ambiguity and messiness of everyday life. And I'm not saying that this is something I've achieved. I'm saying that's something I've been interested in doing and I've been trying to do. So I'll show you a couple of examples from the student essays. And again, they are not really, I did not ask them about distraction, attention. These are kind of mundane little stories about how it feels. There's a lot of stuff about frustration, anxiety. So this is from around 2012, and I'm not going to read these loud. Basically, this kind of promise, which is the same promise as social media tries to, I mean, that's the promise of social media that, will distract you from boredom. So you don't need this flatness in your life. But in these stories, there is a really kind of repeating sense of daily routines, but also the importance of these little kind of micro experiences that make a dull lecture, for example, more bearable. So this is from maybe 9 years ago. I think if she would be writing today, having 4 tabs open probably wouldn't be that radical a statement to make. But basically, in these narratives of loss, the speeding up of culture, the fact that there's so much everything, we are distracted, we can't focus, is a story of loss. In these essays, it's more that it's frustrating, monotonous and boring just to focus on one thing. So the simultaneity of attention, or at least simultaneity in objects of potential attention, then it's not something that for these people kind of impoverishes everyday life. It's actually something quite different. That doesn't mean that they are not frustrated and anxious or bored, but this definitely is not reducible to a narrative of loss. And it's a recurrent trope in these is the issue with slowness. So it's not the fast speed and kind of functionality of network connections in particular. It's in these, a lot of these essays really talk about the infrastructural importance of connectivity in particular, and also the importance of, let's say, a cell phone in and for everyday life. But also this sense like if things don't work with the speed that you are accustomed to, he gets a little empty feeling inside, as if something was missing. So on the one hand, there is this desire for distraction in these essays. Speed, it's not really a problem. Forced slowness, when you're forced to a speed or rhythm that you haven't chosen, that's something that's really difficult. I think this all speaks of what Ingrid Richardson discusses as technosoma in her work on mobile cultures, how the rhythms of devices and apps become in a way ingrained in our everyday rhythms, in our bodily rhythms, and they also are ways and capacities to act. And in a way, they become almost prosthetic in the sense that we are so used to certain interactions with apps and devices. So if they suddenly operate with a different tempo and rhythm, then the rhythm of our everyday life, that is very much somatic as well, it's not just cognitive, becomes ruptured. And our embodied capacity to act becomes altered, and in this instance, not in a nice way. So this is an excerpt from a long discussion of how it feels to be on a train Wi-Fi that is really slow, and how that sense of stuckness with the Wi-Fi that might work or might not work, or is just really slow, becomes this kind of unbearable slowness in how you are. You can't move forward, you are stuck. And this is not the stuckness of boredom, as lack of affect, as this sense of, the present here and now stretching on eternally. This is more what I think what Richardson discusses as this technosoma, bodily rhythm, that comes into being in our everyday cohabitation with apps and devices. And this is the last one. So what cuts through these essays, not all of them, but many of them, is this sense that they are not external. Technologies that we use are not external. They might not be the excitements that make the self, but they are the means through which we can access excitements, some of the excitements that make the self, but they are also very much infrastructural, just in everyday life, how it can operate. And of course, this is from a very, in a context that's, uses of mobile data in Finland are the highest in the world. It's very much a mobile phone culture, and it's really difficult to operate as a citizen if you don't have, well, network connectivity, but even an app. How do you, use an online bank? You need a mobile app to identify yourself. It just goes on and on. But here, what is being discussed, what he's discussing, it's something else. It's not just about the functionalities, it's about the stuff that makes the self. So social media basically is the stuff of minor excitements, enchantments, and the kind of, it is, and that's Jodie Dean's argument from a while back, that it's this search for some kind of effective jolt, something that propels us to click, swipe, share, and like, the effective fuel of our actions, as she writes. As micro events, these different kind of minor, small enchantments can add to a sense of liveliness. I mean, that's kind of like the aspirational mode here, as these oscillations of intensity that then make the self as something of a patchwork that then both relates to and attaches itself to and assembles diverse objects and object worlds into attachments, into antagonisms, into non-relations as well. So to think about us being the stuff that excites us, it's important to think about the multiplicity of things at play in any given moment or over stretches of time as well. And while much affect inquiry has been interested in these kind of like events involving drama, like rupture and such, everyday lives are largely composed of precisely events in such minor scales, the messiness, the ambiguity that comes with that. And I think that to think of us being me, and I'm sorry, I'm now using the us, but as a kind of like a exercise in thought, let's put it that way. Like if we were to think of the self as being made up in a patchwork fashion, so that the excitements that shape us, they can be larger, smaller, medium, impossible to actually consider in terms of size. They can, but they don't need to connect to one another. And this then means that excitements come in these unmatching patterns and textures, materials and scales. But then within these, attention and distraction aren't really, they are not the thing that is opposing one another. It's more about the shifts in these different things that can excite us. It's about rerouting of attention. It's about the intensity of attention. And if you think about distraction and attention in this way, then of course they become very difficult to tell apart. And this is not a new argument. This is Jonathan Crary's argument. 96, I think, when he was writing about industrialization and basically the attention economies of industrialized labor. But I think what this allows us to do is to consider excitements as heterogeneous, conflicting, surprising and paradoxical. And then, maybe we can think of society, culture, individual people, me, as made up in the same vein. I mean, maybe, and I think that might be helpful actually, to consider the both and, the simultaneity, the mismatch, the mess of it. And I'm going to end. I'm not going to talk forever. So 2 more gifts and we are done. So one way to approach this would be through Tompkins's, Tompkins has a very kind of clear division between negative and positive affect, but then there is the neutral affect or affect pair of startle, surprise, which he calls a restarter affect. So it's kind of like, it's open-ended. So it's about rerouting of attention. It's a rupture that happens when you are surprised, or then in a stronger intensity, you are startled. So that means that the body moves from one state to another, and also from one affective state to another. and it can go any old way in terms of the intensities entailed, because it is a rupture. I mean, you never know what's going to happen in moments of surprise. It can be like a good one, or it can be a not so pleasant one. And I think what this idea of thinking of distraction as enabling this restarter effect of startle surprise, it's also important to return to the diagnosis I started out with in thinking about scholarship and how we do research. And here I'm thinking of Eve Sedgwick's critique of paranoid reading a while back, basically these modes of critical analysis where the problem, let's say the function of ideology, is always known from the start, and then we rediscover what we've known is there all along, so there isn't much of a surprise. And Sedgwick was arguing for a more kind of vulnerable and messy approach, being open to us not knowing, being open that we may not actually know, but also what was key to her article was being open to surprise, which of course has to do with us not knowing beforehand what we are gonna maybe find out, but also being surprised by the objects that we studied, maybe being surprised that there is this ambiguity to them, maybe being surprised about the realm of experiences that become attached to them, the social life of cultural objects, this sense that we might not know, we might never know, but we're going to try to find out. And this, of course, links back to feminist epistemology. Not so much to think about. I mean, Donna Haraway's work in particular on partial knowledges that are always grounded in a very specific context, and we are responsible for what we do in a particular context. And then if we start generalizing, it really has to happen with great care and astuteness, because generalizing accounts of what is happening to us in society and culture, what app culture means expansively, globally, everywhere, or what a rhythm and an app is doing to us. It's doing away with differences, nuances, and ambiguities that I think really matter, and that we need to hold on to. And this doesn't mean, as I've said, doing away with the macro or ignoring issues of structure. And I think those really do matter in multiple levels. I mean, we are living in a geopolitical situation where it's kind of evident that things on a macro scale really do matter. But in this logic of both and, trying to hold onto both of them at the same time, and then the challenge becomes of how we move through and across these scales and also bring them together into something like cultural analysis. But that's it for me. And we have about 15 minutes, I think, for something more interactive. Thank you. And I'll let Lucy go now.
Okay, so I think that these very gloomy, very apocalyptic predictions of like just phrases that we throw around very carelessly, like having the attention span of a goldfish, I think they're always phrased in very absolutist terms. And what they seem to do to me is actually distract us from what is really going on and what we are actually doing online all the time. And bringing in this idea of intensities of attention and also of different interests at different times of the day, I think really opens up that discussion and allows us for a far more fine-grained analysis of what we are actually doing for a large portion of our lives. So that is extremely helpful to me. So I now want to open up the floor for questions and remarks from the audience, either back home or here in the room with us.
Hi, Susanna. Thank you so much for your lecture. It was so compelling, and I think we're going to build a lot on it in our next talk. I'm really interested in this logic of scale that you were describing. Can I hear a little bit more about what you think about the macro scale and how platforms and maybe like the financial incentive of platforms have to do with our attention spans and how we modulate our attention online? I'd be really interested in hearing what you have to say about that.
Thank you. That is not an easy question, as you know. I mean, platform economies, because they basically, I mean, all advertising platforms, they operate through monetization of user data. So they want us to generate as much data as we can through posts, likes, shares, and comments. So it's really, and a lot of that is about creating an effective economy. So on the one hand, it is about capturing attention and catering enough stuff to keep, enough novelty coming in. But then it's also about monetizing particular kinds of affect. So if we think about the wow, the likes and the ha-has, the wow of Facebook might be like the startled surprise, and then we get the sad, angry. Now, if you're an advertiser, you might not want your posts next to, your commercial messages next to kind of content that gets like sad and angry, because then, people are wrongly attuned. So when Facebook expanded from the like to these alternatives, it was very explicitly stated that what they want to do is bring kind of qualitative insight, not just about, talking about attention as, this is a like and hence I'm paying attention, but talking about different qualities of attention in this very kind of clumsy schematic. But there is the whole kind of, what's that called now? Forget the term in English, but there's a whole industry of basically opinion mining, but effective kind of analysis that tries to do this in a very kind of fine-grained manner. And of course, if Facebook then, for example, as the leading global platform, can predict on the basis of previous behaviors what people are likely to respond to positively. And of course, sarcasm isn't like, it's not something that can be addressed in this comment, but like let's say loves and likes, those would be like good currency. If they can predict on the basis of previous actions by the users what they might like, then of course they'll amp up the visibility of such content as opposed to other content, because it is an advertising platform and the real customers are the advertisers. We are just, we are the eyeballs and the content producers at the same time. This is the same reason why these platforms are weeding out sexual communication and sexual content, because advertisers don't want their messages placed next to this kind of content. Some advertisers might, but, let's say like McDonald's probably does not. Yeah, so it plays a huge role in terms of how attention obviously is harvested, but then also how these platforms try to transform affect into data that can then be harvested, analyzed, mined, and in a way sold, similarly to any user data. And I think it's a really interesting and scary development as well. And then, of course, if we talk about, there are many macro scales involved beyond just the kind of economies of a single platform. But I think very concretely looking at how platforms try to measure scale and deploy not just attention, but certain kinds of attention, and the way that they can measure that attention is then through kind of more semantic analysis, if you like. Not sure I mentioned, but did I answer your question at all?
No, you definitely did. That was very interesting. If you don't mind, I have like 2 follow-up questions, because you mentioned sarcasm as something that can't really be read. So would you think of sarcasm and possibly irony as a way to subvert attention capture? And you also mentioned micro events and the, provoking a wow reaction is what's most profitable to advertisers. And is that a mobilization of micro events in a way that kind of like depowers them for us because they're becoming commodified?
Yeah, there is a lot of research actually on trying to spot sarcasm, because it is like the glitch here. But anyone familiar with online cultures, knows that it's the stuff of ambiguity, sarcasm, irony. It's like the vernaculars of online communication prior to the emergence of social media. But in a way, because the models through which, let's say, affect has become, it's like a taxonomical understanding of affect, where you can actually put things in neat boxes and not pay attention to how things might, we might be fascinated by that which disgusts us. We might be turned on by that which we are horribly ashamed of. I mean, a little bit of Freud, that's not like, it's not an uncommon thing, for example. So this kind of intermeshing and mutual amplification of affect, it really doesn't have much room in this taxonomical view. So on the one hand, there are many, there's like the Go Rando app that, if you want to like something, it will just choose reaction topic for you. So there are these kind of like a very minoritarian tools for diverting attention economy. But it's on such a minor scale that I really wonder to what extent can it help. And I would say because sarcasm and irony precede social media, they might not be the solution because they are being monetized. Wow is a really interesting one because it's also like, it can be, it's very passive aggressive. It's sarcastic. It's not just like this, like, wow, dude. It really has a different connotation. It's like similar to the care reaction option introduced within the pandemic. That is used in so sarcastic ways. Interpretations vary from rimming to Mayan heart sacrifice in terms of what it signifies on semantic terms or visual terms. But there's this mismatch, I would say, between the kind of taxonomical understanding of affect and even this kind of effective, I think it's called empathy analytics, actually, that's the term. And they might have, and what they try to do is combine these databases of linguistic terms, so terms used to describe affective states, and they have like 100,000 of different terms, and then they try to sort of figure out how these terms express affect in ways that is not just taxonomical, but the underlying principle really is. But that's a big emerging. It's already pretty big, but it's still an emergent economy in terms of selling audiences to advertisers. So it's mainly about helping corporate entities to income, or to pave way for users to have empathy towards the advertiser. That's the logic, basically. And then what advertisers can do to facilitate that. No, I'm very hesitant as to what the concrete options are to kind of like diverting this economy. I'm not sure, like the kind of politics of, using a ha-ha instead of something else. I'm not really sure it's working because the whole economy is so exploitative in terms of what is being done with user data at the current moment. So I'm not a Pollyanna, and if that is like the impression that comes across in my book or my talk, then that will be a first. Yeah, but in these days it maybe doesn't take much to become a Pollyanna because the times are bad. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Susanna, I was very impressed because it's not Pollyanna to look at the multiple sides of a question, and I think that's what you're helping. And since I will be much more of the negative side, I so appreciate yours. But in particular, I was interested in what you evoked at one part of your talk that reminded me of Walter Ong's work, in which he was saying how our external technologies are changing our internal rhythms. He did not use the word rhythms like you, but I'm studying, as well as many others on this panel, the physiological, the biological, the neurological, the how we are being changed internally. Could you comment from your perspective on some of those internal changes?
Well, that's a difficult one. And I'm not sure I can in terms of my research material, because basically, what I'm building on empirically is this sample of the student essays, and they are basically they are moments in time. And of course they are coursework, so they are very particular. There's much I could say about how specific they are. So they are, they are not really dealing with temporality. So some of them might, say once upon a time there was a moment such as this, but they're not excellent at looking at transformation over time in capacities. Now, of course, I mean, I'm of the age that I did do essays on a typewriter in the early 90s when I was a very green young thing, studying film and TV. I don't think there would be any way that I could compose a 10-page essay on a typewriter without rewriting it 600 times. And of course, I was also very bad at typing, so those were not pretty papers. But just this kind of shift from how, I mean, currently I can't think without the option of writing and then cutting and pasting and editing. It just doesn't, I mean, I'm sure I can think on some level, but not really, not in a structured way. So I think it's very concretely the tools that I've been using daily for, well, about 30 years at this point. They really are very much ingrained in how I can be. And with anything that's infrastructural, it only becomes visible when it's not available. And then you sort of see how something that used to be like, let's say, you know, I'm also of the age that I remember when cell phones didn't have online connectivity as a default function. And now if that's missing, then it's kind of broken, you know. It's like with a laptop, if the Wi-Fi doesn't work, the device isn't working, which is rather different from the kind of dial-up cultures. And because of that ubiquitous connectivity, the kind of reliance on the functionality of devices really does govern how we can live in very, I mean, from very trivial things, remembering phone numbers, remembering stuff that I can Google. I mean, some of it is very trivial, but then the stuff that is less trivial, it's really difficult to trace. I mean, in a way, in terms of my own experience, of course, I mean, I could go on about that. But I think to get at that, then I would have needed a very different set of, so I can, of course, share, I mean, as I do in the book, share anecdotes about me, because that's one way that I can talk about experience that's specific, and also help, and that helps to make things more concrete, I think. Like, you know, the shift from 80s media culture to the current day, and what that means on very concrete terms. But in terms of studying that, I think, I mean, the kind of work that you are doing and others are doing, I mean, that's the way to get to it, not my student essays, really, although they are fascinating, but then I'm unbiased.
Good. Thank you so much.
Maybe this is a great place to end this part of the session. I have a million questions to ask you, but I have to wait until later, and I could listen to you for hours on this topic, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. So I want to thank you so much, Susanna Paasonen, and I